A warning. This episode contains scenes that may be disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised.
Calaroga Shark Media. Hello, and welcome to Murder Weekly. This episode is titled The Crimson Shadow.
The night in Whitmore was thick with a fog that clung to the skin like a damp shroud. The moon, a mere sliver in the sky, cast a weak and trembling light on the town's deserted streets. It was on this night that the Crimson Shadow would earn its name, weaving a tale of horror and bloodshed into the fabric of the town's history. Detective Sarah Blake stood at the edge of the crime scene, her stomach churning as she surveyed the grotesque display before her. The body lay in the center of the alley, a macabre work of art rendered in blood and flesh. The victim, a man in his mid-30s, was sprawled on his back, his arms and legs twisted in unnatural angles. His eyes, wide open and staring into the void, reflected the horror of his final moments. The most disturbing aspect of the scene was the intricate pattern carved into the man's chest. It was a symbol that Sarah had seen before, a twisted sigil that had become the calling card of a serial killer who had evaded capture for months. Each murder was more brutal than the last. The killer's skill in manipulating human flesh almost artistic in its precision. Sarah's partner, Detective Mark Jennings, joined her, his face pale under the flickering streetlight. "Another one," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The Crimson Shadow strikes again. As they moved closer to examine the body, the details of the murder became clearer. The victim's throat had been slit, a deep, gaping wound that suggested a frenzied attack. Blood had pooled around the body, seeping into the cracks of the cobblestone alley. But it was the careful carving on the chest that held Sarah's attention. The precision of the cuts, the way the flesh had been peeled back, it was almost surgical. "The killer is escalating," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the nausea that churned in her gut. "Each murder is more elaborate, more violent. It's like they're perfecting their technique." Mark nodded, his eyes scanning the scene. "There has to be a pattern, a connection between the victims. We're missing something." They spent hours at the crime scene, collecting evidence, taking photographs, and interviewing the few who had ventured out into the night. But as dawn broke over Whitmore, they were no closer to understanding the mind of the Crimson Shadow. They needed help. The office of Dr. Adrian Shaw was a stark contrast to the chaos of the police precinct. Lined with books on psychology and criminology, the room exuded a sense of calm and order. The wall behind his desk was adorned with commendations and degrees, testifying to his expertise. Shaw extended his hand, greeting them with a polite, almost rehearsed smile. "Detectives, thank you for coming. I've been following the Crimson Shadow case closely in the news. A disturbing series of events, to say the least," Dr. Shaw said, motioning them to sit. Sarah and Mark took their seats, their files and notes in hand. Sarah began, "Dr. Shaw, we appreciate your willingness to consult on this case. We're at a bit of a dead end, no pun, and your expertise in criminal psychology might provide the insight we need." Dr. Shaw nodded, his eyes scanning the files Sarah placed on his desk. "I'll help in any way I can. Understanding the mind of a killer is often the key to unmasking them," he replied, his tone measured and thoughtful. Mark chimed in, "We believe the killer is not just committing murders, but is communicating something through them. The patterns, the ritualistic nature of the killings." Dr. Shaw leaned forward, interlocking his fingers. "Yes, the ritual aspect is fascinating. It suggests a killer who is highly organized and detail-oriented. They're not just killing, they're creating a narrative, a story written in blood and fear." Sarah felt a chill at his words. "So, you believe these murders are a form of expression for the killer?" "Exactly," Dr. Shaw said, his gaze intense. "The Crimson Shadow, as the press calls him, is not just a murderer. He's an artist in his own twisted way. He's staging these scenes for an audience, perhaps for himself, or perhaps for us." Mark frowned. "But what's the message? What's the purpose behind this grotesque art?" Dr. Shaw leaned back, pondering. "That's what we need to uncover. The symbolism in the carvings, the choice of victims, the locations, each is a piece of a larger puzzle. And the key to solving it lies in understanding the mind behind it." As the body count rose, so did the fear that gripped Whitmore. No one was safe from the Crimson Shadow, whose murders seemed random and unprovoked. The town was in the grip of a predator, one who reveled in blood and pain. Sarah and Mark found themselves drawn into a game of cat and mouse, where each clue led to more questions than answers. The killer was taunting them, leaving cryptic messages at each crime scene, a trail of breadcrumbs that led only to madness. The climax of their hunt came on a stormy night, the rain washing the streets in sheets of water. They had received a tip, a possible sighting of the Crimson Shadow near an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. As they approached the warehouse, the air was thick with the scent of decay. The building loomed before them, a monolith of rust and rotting wood, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes. The rain pounded on the roof, a relentless drumming that echoed the racing of their hearts. Inside, the warehouse was a labyrinth of shadows and debris. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of a nightmare. Bloodstains smeared the walls, handprints dragged down in crimson streaks. The air was heavy with the stench of iron and fear. They found the next victim in the center of the main hall, a tableau of horror that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The body was suspended from the rafters, limbs bound with barbed wire, the skin flayed in intricate patterns. Below it, a pool of blood reflected the grotesque scene like a dark, sinister mirror. Sarah felt a surge of anger and helplessness. Each murder was more depraved than the last, a testament to the killer's growing confidence and cruelty. The Crimson Shadow was not just a murderer. They were an artist of death, using human bodies as their canvas. As they searched the warehouse, a chilling realization dawned on them. The killer was still there, watching them from the shadows. They could feel the weight of their gaze, a pressure that crawled over their skin. Then, the killer emerged, a figure cloaked in darkness, their face obscured by a mask of blood and shadow. In their hand, a knife gleamed, slick with fresh blood. The Crimson Shadow had been waiting for them, the final act of their macabre performance ready to unfold. The confrontation was a blur of movement and violence. The killer moved with a grace and speed that was almost inhuman, their attacks precise and deadly. Sarah and Mark fought back, their training kicking in, but they were unprepared for the ferocity of their adversary. In the struggle, Sarah managed to tear the mask from the killer's face, revealing the twisted features of someone they had never suspected. Time seemed to stand still. The face revealed was not that of a stranger, but Dr. Adrian Shaw, the very man who had been aiding their investigation. His eyes, once calm and understanding, now glinted with a madness that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The realization hit her like a physical blow. All those meetings, the discussions where he had seemed so intent on helping them understand the killer's mind, he had been toying with them, relishing in the proximity to the chaos he had created. Dr. Shaw's voice, once so reassuring, now carried a chilling note of triumph. "You see, Detective Blake, understanding the mind of a killer requires a certain empathy. Who better to catch a murderer than the murderer himself?
Murder Weekly is a Calaroga Shark media production, written and hosted by Aidan I. Flanagan, produced by Mark Francis, executive producers Mark Francis and John McDermott. Calaroga Shark Media.